The hook ripped open with a single phone call. Tessa Rowan was finishing a 12-hour shift at Mercy General when the voice came through the line. Low, unhurried, almost bored, the way a man sounds when he is very certain of his power. He told her Lena owed $40,000 to people who did not accept payment plans. He told her she had 72 hours. Then he sent a video. Her sister, 23 years old, zip-tied to a folding chair in a room with no windows, her face swollen on one side, her eyes searching for a camera she couldn't find. Lena wasn't crying. That was the part that broke Tessa completely. Lena had stopped crying, which meant she had already given up waiting to be saved. If you have ever had to choose between doing what is legal and doing what your family needs to survive, you already understand the choice Tessa made in that hospital parking lot at 2 a.m. If you haven't, pray you never do. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because I promise you, this is only the beginning. The call came on a Tuesday, which was the most ordinary Tuesday of Tessa's life right up until it wasn't. She had worked the trauma bay since 6 a.m. 3 car accidents, 1 overdose, a 17-year-old with a skateboard injury that looked minor until the CT scan came back and suddenly was not minor at all. By the time she handed her charts to the night nurse and stripped off her gloves, her feet were throbbing and she was already thinking about the leftover rice in her refrigerator and whether she had the energy to microwave it or whether she would just eat it cold standing over the sink. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The man on the other end didn't introduce himself. He said, "Your sister borrowed something that didn't belong to her." His voice had an accent she couldn't place. Not quite anything she recognized, which she would later understand was deliberate. People like him practiced being unplaceable. 40,000. 72 hours. We'll send you instructions. Tessa stopped walking. She was standing in the middle of the hospital corridor, a janitor pushing a mop past her, a wall-mounted television playing a weather segment with the sound off. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, because that was the only thing she could think to say. "You will," he said. "Check your phone." The video came through 30 seconds later. She watched it in a bathroom stall with the door locked and both hands gripping the phone so hard the screen creaked. Lena. The chair. The room. The face. Tessa had seen bad things in her years of nursing. Genuinely bad. The kind that follow you home and sit at the foot of your bed. But watching her little sister's expression in that video was a different category of bad. It was the expression of someone who had decided hope was a liability. Tessa sat on the toilet lid and put her face in her hands and did not make a sound. She gave herself exactly 90 seconds. Then she stood up, washed her face at the sink, looked at herself in the mirror until she recognized the person looking back, and walked out. She spent the next 4 hours trying to do it the right way. She called the police. A detective named Harrigan took her information with the particular careful blankness that experienced detectives use when they are not optimistic but don't want to say so. He told her trafficking cases required federal coordination. He told her $40,000 suggested mid-tier operators, not top-tier, which he seemed to think was encouraging. He told her the video lacked location metadata. He told her to go home, try to get some rest, and wait for his call. He gave her a card. The card had a non-emergency number on it. She called the FBI field office next. An agent named Pulaski was professionally sympathetic and told her much of the same thing Harrigan had told her, in slightly different order. He asked if Lena had any history of substance abuse, any prior contact with known criminal associates, any gambling debts. Tessa said no to all 3. Pulaski said he'd open a file and be in touch. She tried to pull the $40,000 from her savings account. She had $11,400 and some change. She'd been paying down student loans for 6 years. She called her mother's number out of reflex and then remembered, halfway through dialing, that her mother had been gone for 3 years. She sat in her car in the hospital parking garage for a long time after that. The concrete above her head had a water stain shaped roughly like a handprint. She stared at it. She thought about Lena at 7 years old, sitting on the kitchen counter eating cereal dry from the box because the milk had gone bad, and their mother hadn't noticed yet. She thought about Lena at 14, calling her from a friend's house because the friend's older brother was being scary and she needed someone to come get her. She thought about Lena at 23, which was a zip-tied chair in a windowless room somewhere in this city. A car pulled into the space beside her. A man got out. He was medium height, medium build, wearing a dark jacket that cost more than Tessa's monthly rent. He leaned down and looked through her passenger window with no particular expression on his face and said, through the glass, "Ms. Rowan, my employer would like a word." Tessa's hand went to the door lock. Too slow. The door was already opening from the outside. She found out later that the lock had been electronically overridden from a device the size of a USB drive. She found out a lot of things later that she hadn't wanted to know. The car they put her in was black and warm and smelled like leather and some kind of cedar-based cologne. There was a man already seated in the back. He was looking at his phone when she got in, and he didn't look up for almost 20 seconds after the door closed, which she understood immediately was intentional. A demonstration, quiet and total, of who held the clock in this conversation. Then he looked up. Damian Vescari was not what she expected. She'd heard the name. Everyone in the city had heard the name, the way you hear thunder before you see lightning, the way certain words appear in newspaper articles with careful lawyer-driven phrasing like alleged and reportedly linked to. She had expected someone older, or louder, or more visibly dangerous. Instead, she found a man who looked roughly 40, with sharp features and dark eyes that processed information the way a camera does, cataloging without reacting. He was well-dressed in a way that had stopped caring about impressing anyone. He looked tired in a way he was very practiced at hiding. "I'm going to save you time," he said. His voice was level. Not friendly, not threatening. Simply the voice of someone who had long ago burned through patience for unnecessary steps. "You've already spoken to the police. You've spoken to federal agents. You've done the math on your savings. You're short approximately $28,000 and running out of hours." Tessa stared at him. "How do you know any of that?" "Because I've been watching the situation since before you received the call." He set his phone face down on his knee. "The men who took your sister operate under a network called the Meridian Group. They handle debt collection for several organizations in this city. Your sister borrowed money from a man named Gregor Voss 2 months ago. The original amount was $12,000. The current amount, with interest and fees and whatever they've decided to add, is $40,000. Lena doesn't have 12,000 reasons to borrow from someone like that," Tessa said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she'd expected. "She was trying to keep her apartment," Damian said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact, delivered cleanly. She'd been behind for 4 months. She went through a broker who told her the terms were reasonable. The broker works for Voss. The terms were not reasonable. Tessa's jaw tightened. Lena had told her things were fine. Lena had been telling her things were fine for months. In that particular way of someone who knows they are not fine, but cannot stand the look on their big sister's face when they admit it. "What do you want?" Tessa said. Damian looked at her for a moment. "I have a proposal." "I'm not in the mood for euphemisms." Something crossed his face that might have been appreciation. It was gone fast. "Fair. Here it is directly. I need a wife. Specifically, I need a woman with no organized crime history, no criminal record, no family entanglements in this world, who can appear convincingly at a level of social function that my position requires. I'm expected to present a spouse at the Halverson Foundation Gala in 11 days. Several of my current arrangements depend on that presentation going smoothly. The woman I had arranged for this purpose removed herself from the situation last week." He said this last part without particular emotion, which told Tessa more about the situation than any amount of emotion would have. "You need a wife," she repeated. "In name. There would be a legal contract. The arrangement has a defined term, 18 months, with optional extension by mutual agreement. You would have living arrangements, security, a monthly allowance. At the end of the term, a clean separation, no strings, and enough money to restart your life however you choose." Tessa looked at her hands. They were still shaking very slightly. She'd noticed that in the parking garage and had been managing it since. And Lena, "Well, within 48 hours of your agreement, your sister comes home. You can actually do that." "I can do that," he said. Not bragging, just accurate. And if I say no, you leave this car and continue on your current path. He picked up his phone again, which was either a gesture of indifference or the most controlled way of making a point she'd ever seen. I don't compel. That's not my method. Tessa looked out the window. They were still in the parking garage. The concrete above the window had another water stain on it, different shape. She thought, if I say yes to this man, I will be walking into something I cannot fully see. She thought, if I say no to this man, I already know exactly what I am walking toward, and it ends with a zip-tied chair and a face that has stopped hoping. I want it in writing, she said. Everything. Lena's release, the terms, the end date. Everything written and signed before I agree to anything. Damian's eyes moved to her. Obviously, he said. She slept 3 hours that night on the couch in her own apartment, still in her scrubs, the contract printed and in a folder on the coffee table in front of her. She'd had a lawyer friend look it over by phone, her friend Deborah, who did estate planning and was absolutely not qualified for this, but was the best Tessa could access at 1 a.m. Deborah had said, in a voice very carefully controlled, Tessa, this is the cleanest contract I've read in 10 years. Whatever else this man is, his legal team is extraordinary. Then she'd said, please be careful. And Tessa had said she would, and they both knew the word careful didn't quite cover it. She signed it at 2:47 in the morning. The first thing that happened was nothing. She had expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Sirens, maybe. Activity. Some outward sign that a machine had been set in motion. Instead, her phone stayed quiet. Her apartment stayed quiet. She lay on the couch and watched the ceiling and thought about all the ways this could go wrong and then stopped thinking about it because the list was too long. The second thing that happened was that Damian's driver arrived at 7:15 the next morning to take her to what the contract referred to as the primary residence. She was allowed to bring whatever she could fit in 2 suitcases. She brought practical things, her good nursing shoes, her medications, her laptop, a photograph of her and Lena from a beach trip 3 years ago. She stood at her door for a moment before she pulled it shut, looking at her apartment, at the small, ordinary accumulation of her life, and she had the strange sensation of watching herself from the outside, the way you sometimes see yourself in a dream doing something you know is irrational but cannot stop. She pulled the door shut. The mansion was not what she expected either, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something more openly fortress-like, maybe, with visible security and locked gates and the trappings of threat. What she found instead was a very old brownstone on the Upper East Side that had been expanded and renovated with the kind of money that does not announce itself. From the street, it looked like an exceptionally well-maintained private residence. Inside it was something else. High ceilings, dark wood, rooms that were genuinely beautiful in a way that felt earned rather than staged. Staff who moved through the corridors with a quietness that suggested long practice. She was shown to her rooms on the 3rd floor by a woman named Sylvie, who was 50-ish and efficient and had the particular quality of someone who has worked for powerful people long enough that nothing surprises her anymore. Sylvie showed her the closet, already stocked, her sizes apparently having been obtained by some method Tessa chose not to think about, and the bathroom, and the view, which looked out over a garden that had a locked iron gate and was unreasonably beautiful for something in the middle of this city. Mr. Vescari will speak with you at 4, Sylvie said. Fine, Tessa said. Sylvie paused at the door. There's one thing. Her voice was neutral, professionally so, but her eyes were doing something more careful. The 4th floor is off limits, not locked. The stairwell is accessible, but it is his private floor, and he has asked that it be respected. Tessa looked at her. Okay. Also, Sylvie said, and then stopped, as if reconsidering. Then, the staff here have been with the family a long time. We do not involve ourselves in things that are not our concern, but we notice things. What kinds of things? Tessa said. Sylvie met her eyes. Things worth noticing, she said, and left. Tessa spent the morning unpacking, which didn't take long, and then sitting on the edge of the bed in a room that was larger and quieter and more expensive than anywhere she had ever lived, thinking about what Sylvie had meant. She'd spent 12 years as an emergency nurse, which meant she had spent 12 years in rooms where people said things that meant other things, where what someone told you and what their body did were often two different sentences. She knew how to read the second sentence. She was pretty sure Sylvie had just told her, in the language of someone who has learned to be very careful, to pay attention. She paid attention. At 4 o'clock, she went downstairs to the study she'd been shown on the brief walkthrough. Damian was already there. He was standing at the window with a coffee mug in one hand and several papers in the other, and he looked like a man interrupted in the middle of a workday that had started very early and showed no signs of ending. He gestured to the chair across from his desk without looking up. She sat. She waited. He finished reading whatever he was reading, set it down, looked at her. "You're going to meet someone named Marcus Hale this evening. He's my head of external affairs. He'll brief you on what you need to know for public appearances, what to say, what not to say, how to handle press." "I'm not going to perform for press," Tessa said. Damian looked at her steadily. "You don't have to perform. You have to not contradict a cover story that's already been prepared. There's a difference." "What's the cover story?" "That we met 18 months ago through a mutual contact in the medical field, that we've been together privately and are now making it official, that you prefer to keep your professional life separate, which explains why nothing about you has appeared publicly until now." He paused. "It's not a complicated story. It's designed to require very little active deception on your part." "That's thoughtful," she said, flatly. He didn't react to the flatness. "It's practical. Complicated lies require maintenance. Simple ones hold longer." She looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," he said, which was not the same as yes, but was not quite a no. "The woman," she said. "The one who was supposed to do this before me. What happened with her?" Something moved through his expression and was gone so fast she almost missed it. But she'd been trained to notice the things people's faces did before they managed them, and she noted it, filed it away. "She made a different calculation," he said. "It happens." "A different calculation," Tessa repeated. "About what?" "About risk," he said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that was not level at all, and she was pretty sure, not certain, but pretty sure, that he knew she could hear it. "This isn't a safe environment. You should understand that clearly." "I treated a gunshot victim at 2 a.m. last April," Tessa said. "I've had patients who died holding my hand. I've had a man pull a knife on me in the trauma bay because he was detoxing and terrified. I understand what unsafe looks like." He looked at her. A real look this time. Not the cataloging camera look, but something slightly different. Something with a fraction more attention in it. "You might be surprised," he said finally, "at what unsafe looks like in this context." "Then surprise me," she said. He didn't. Not that afternoon. He told her what she needed to know for Marcus Hale's briefing and dismissed her with the efficiency of a man with 6 other things already waiting on his desk. She walked back up to her room and stood at the window and looked at the garden with its locked iron gate and thought, 48 hours. Just get to 48 hours. 37 hours later, her phone rang. It was Lena's number. She answered before the first ring finished. "Tessa." Lena's voice was rough, like she'd been somewhere with bad air, but it was her voice, recognizably hers, with that particular way she said Tessa's name that she'd had since they were children. "Tessa, I don't know what happened. Someone drove me to a train station and told me to call you, and I don't—" "Are you hurt?" Tessa said. Her voice was doing the steady thing again, the nurse voice, the professional management of her own panic. "My face," Lena said, "and my wrists a little, but Tessa, where are you? What's going on?" "I'm going to explain everything," Tessa said, "but first tell me which train station." She was in the car to Penn Station within 4 minutes, Damian's driver, without being asked. She sat in the back seat and watched the city go by outside the window and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound so tight for 2 days, she'd stopped noticing the tension, the way you stop noticing a high-pitched sound after long enough, until it stops. She found Lena sitting on a bench near the main entrance with a paper cup of something hot and an expression that kept moving between relief and confusion and something that looked a lot like guilt. They didn't say anything for a long moment. Tessa just sat down beside her and put one arm around her shoulders and let her sister lean in and felt the particular weight of someone who had been very afraid for a long time finally letting go of some of it. "I was trying to handle it myself," Lena said quietly, into Tessa's shoulder. "The money. I didn't want you to have to—" "I know," Tessa said. "How did you get them to let me go?" There was a beat of silence. The train station noise moved around them, the announcements and the echoes and the feet on marble. Tessa looked straight ahead at the departure board, at all those names of places, all those other destinations. "I made a deal," she said. Lena lifted her head and looked at her. "What kind of deal?" Tessa looked at her sister's face, the bruise along her cheekbone, the careful way she held her wrists, the eyes that were already asking a question they hadn't fully formed yet. She thought about the contract in the folder back in that third-floor room. She thought about 18 months and what might happen inside 18 months that she couldn't predict or plan for, and about a locked fourth floor she'd been told to leave alone, and a woman who'd made a different calculation about risk and walked away, and a man whose eyes did something real for about a quarter of a second before he closed it back up. "The kind that gets you home," Tessa said. "That's all you need to know right now." Lena watched her for another moment. Then she leaned back against her shoulder, and Tessa tightened her arm, and the departure board clicked over to a new set of destinations. And somewhere in the Upper East Side, in a study on the second floor of an old brownstone with a garden no one used, a man who had not trusted anyone in years was sitting at his desk reading a file on a woman who had just walked into his world and had not, despite every reason to, looked afraid. Lena stayed 3 nights. Tessa hadn't planned it that way. The contract didn't address it. But Lena arrived at the brownstone with a paper bag of her belongings and eyes that kept darting to the exits, and Damian, who was standing at the foot of the stairs when they walked in and looked at Lena the way a man looks at a math problem he has already solved, said nothing except, "Sylvie will prepare the room adjacent to yours," and walked back into his study. That was it. No discussion, no negotiation. Tessa watched the study door close and felt something she did not want to examine too closely, because it resembled gratitude. And gratitude toward this man felt like a trapdoor she wasn't ready to step onto. Lena sat at the kitchen table that first night with both hands wrapped around a mug and told Tessa everything, or close to everything, in the way that people tell stories when they are still partly inside them, circling around the worst parts, approaching and retreating. The loan had been 2 months ago. She'd lost her job at the marketing firm in January. She hadn't told Tessa because Tessa was already working double shifts to cover her own loan payments, and Lena was 23 and supposed to be past needing her sister to bail her out of things. The broker had been a man named Eddie, who someone at her gym knew, and the terms had seemed fine until they weren't, and then she'd tried to pay back what she could, but the number kept changing and she didn't understand why. And then 3 weeks ago, a different man had come to her apartment, and she understood in her body before she understood in her mind that she had stepped somewhere she could not step back out of on her own. "I should have called you," Lena said. "I know." "Yes," Tessa said. "You're not going to say it's okay." "It's not okay, but it's done." She reached across the table and put her hand over Lena's. "It's done now." Lena looked around the kitchen. It was a kitchen that cost more than her entire apartment building. "Tessa, who is this man?" "Someone who helped." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." Lena studied her with the particular attention of a younger sibling who has spent a lifetime reading their older sibling's face for the things they won't say out loud. "Are you afraid of him?" Tessa considered that honestly. "No," she said finally, "but I think I should probably stay a little afraid. As a precaution." Lena didn't laugh. She looked at Tessa's left hand, at the ring that had appeared there that morning. Plain platinum band, understated, the kind of ring that cost a great deal of money while pretending it didn't, and didn't say anything else about it. The Halverson Foundation Gala was in 9 days. Marcus Hale spent 3 of those days briefing Tessa. He was 40-something, thin, with reading glasses he kept taking on and off, in a manner that suggested he had spent years smoothing over situations that would have destroyed anyone less practiced. He gave her names, dates, relationships, all the information that made up the story of who she was, now supposed to be. She absorbed it the way she absorbed medical protocols. not by trying to feel it, but by repeating it until it was available on reflex. Marcus watched her memorize and, at the end of the second session, said, "You're very good at this," with a quality in his voice she couldn't entirely read. "I'm good at managing information under pressure," she said. "Yes," he said, "that's what I mean." And he said it like it was a complicated thing to be. On the fourth day, Damian called her into the study again. He was at his desk, and there was a man she hadn't seen before standing near the window. Older, late 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of expecting rooms to arrange themselves around you. He had Damian's bone structure in a softened form, and Tessa understood before anyone said anything that this was family. "Tessa," Damian said, "my uncle, Damian Vescari." Lucien turned from the window. He had warm eyes, which was the first thing she noticed, and she noticed it specifically because everything else about him said that the warmth was a decision he had made rather than something that came naturally. He smiled and took her hand and said, "My nephew has kept you very well hidden. I can see why," in the voice of a man who had spent 60-plus years making people feel welcomed and had become genuinely expert at it. "It's nice to meet you," Tessa said. "The gala will be your debut, so to speak," Lucien said, settling into the chair across from Damian's desk as if he owned it. Maybe he did once. "These events are tedious but necessary. I'll introduce you to the people who matter and keep you away from the ones who will ask too many questions." He glanced at Damian. "You should have her meet Elena Marsh before the event. Elena knows everyone and she talks to everyone, which means if Tessa has a conversation with her beforehand, the right version of the story will be everywhere before the appetizers are served." Damian's expression did something careful. "Elena is manageable." "Elena is useful," Lucien corrected pleasantly. "There's a difference." He looked back at Tessa with those warm eyes. "You'll like her. Most people do, at first." After Lucien left, the room held a different quality. Damian was looking at his desk. He had a pen in his hand and wasn't using it, just holding it, and Tessa recognized the gesture. She did something similar with her badge lanyard when she was thinking through something she didn't want to think through. "He seems," she started. "He's effective," Damian said. His voice was neutral in the way that neutral can be its own statement. "He built a significant portion of what this organization is. He knows everyone worth knowing and several people worth watching." He set the pen down. "He also likes being the smartest person in a room, which means he is sometimes careless about rooms where he isn't." It was more than he'd said about anyone since she'd arrived. She filed it away with Sylvie's warning and the quick, careful something in Marcus's voice and built what she was building, brick by quiet brick. The gala happened on a Thursday evening. She wore a black dress that Sylvie had produced from somewhere and heels that she'd practiced walking in for 2 days. And she stood beside Damian in a room full of people who had all made calculations about power and proximity to it and smiled at each other across those calculations. Damian moved through the room with the ease of a man who is never comfortable but has mastered appearing comfortable, which she was beginning to understand was its own kind of skill. He kept his hand at the small of her back when they were being watched and dropped it when they weren't, and she registered both versions without reacting to either. Elena Marsh was exactly what Lucien had promised, and nothing like what Tessa had expected. She was maybe 50, beautiful in a sharp architectural way, and she looked at Tessa with an assessment that lasted about 4 seconds before her expression resolved into something that was either genuine warmth or an extraordinary facsimile of it. "So you're the one," Elena said. "Just that. Not unfriendly, but pointed." "I suppose I am," Tessa said. Elena glanced across the room toward Damian, who was talking to 2 men in dark suits with the expression of a man discussing things that require very precise language. "He hasn't brought anyone to one of these in 6 years, Elena said. "The last time was Mara." She said the name the way you say the name of a weather event that caused significant damage, informatively, not emotionally. "Did he tell you about her?" "He mentioned her briefly," Tessa said, which was approximately true if you counted a 30-second reference to a woman who'd made a different calculation about risk. "Briefly," Elena repeated. She took a sip of her champagne. "Well, I'm sure he'll fill in the rest eventually, or you'll find out another way." She said this like a woman who considers all available means of information equally valid. You should know that some people in this room tonight are trying to figure out if you're real. Specifically, whether you're a real relationship or a positioned one. And what do you think? Tessa said. Elena looked at her. Her eyes were intelligent and slightly amused and very, very watchful. I think, she said carefully, that the most interesting marriages are the ones where both things are true. Then she excused herself with the precise social timing of someone who always leaves before a conversation tips into something they don't want to be part of. The gunshot happened 40 minutes later. Not at the gala itself, close to it, outside, in the loading area behind the venue where two of Damian's security team had gone to rotate a vehicle. One shot. Tessa heard the distant flat sound of it through 3 floors and a marble facade, and she registered it before most people in the room did because she knew that sound, had heard it in the trauma bay, in parking lots, once on the street outside her apartment building, had learned to process it not as signal of fear, but as signal to move. She moved. Not toward the exits, but toward Damian. He was already moving. His security team closed around him like water finding a shape, and she was briefly inside that circle before someone's hand, not rough, but firm, redirected her away from Damian and toward a side corridor. She pulled against it. The hand didn't let go. Mrs. Vescari, a voice said, using the name for the first time, the name she was still getting used to carrying. Please. She went. Because she was not stupid, and because she could see in the room the thing she always tried to prevent, the moment before panic becomes its own emergency, and she understood that adding her own resistance to that would not help anyone. They put her in an anteroom with 2 guards and a water pitcher. She sat on an upholstered chair and thought methodically about what she'd seen. Damian's expression when the distant shot reached the room before his team closed in. She'd seen his face for maybe 1.5 seconds. It had not been fear. It had been something grimmer and more specific, the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he'd been hoping not to confirm. She was in the anteroom for 45 minutes. When Damian came in, he was alone, and he looked like a man who had been through several conversations in rapid succession that had cost him something. 2 of my men were shot, he said. Both survived. One is critical. I should go, she said immediately. I'm a trauma nurse if there's... It's handled. His voice was flat in a way that meant the conversation was not about medical resources. He looked at her. You didn't run. I came toward you. Yes. He said it like he was still processing what category of information that belonged to. Why? She looked at him. Because panic was spreading, and you're the person in that room people look at to know whether they should panic. If you had someone next to you who wasn't panicking, it slows it down. She paused. Also because it seemed like the right direction, and I tend to move toward problems rather than away from them. Professional hazard. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening behind his eyes. Not the quarter second of realness she'd caught before, but something more sustained, something turning over in him like an engine deciding whether to engage. Come with me, he said. She followed him to a room she hadn't been in before, not the study, not the formal rooms, but something more internal to the house, smaller, with shelves of what looked like actual working files rather than displayed books. He closed the door and stood at the window with his back to her for a moment, and she watched the particular quality of tension in his shoulders and thought, he is deciding what to tell me. He turned around. The shot was a message, he said, not an attempt. If they wanted those men dead, they'd be dead. Someone is indicating capability. He said this with the directness of a man summarizing a threat assessment, which was what it was. There are 3 families in this city who might send this kind of signal. 2 of them have standing agreements with mine. 1 doesn't. He paused. I tell you this not because you need to know the operational details, but because you are now visibly connected to me. And visibility has consequences. I want you to understand clearly. I understood those consequences before I signed the contract, Tessa said. You understood them intellectually. And now I understand them otherwise, she said. Okay. What does that change? He looked at her. I want to increase your security. What does that mean practically? It means you don't go anywhere without a team member. It means your sister's location needs to be... No, Tessa said. His expression stiffened. This isn't a negotiation. Lena doesn't get a security detail without my sister understanding what it means, and she can't understand it without understanding the full situation, and I am not dragging her deeper into this." Her voice was very level. "Find another way to keep her safe that doesn't involve bringing her further into your orbit." The silence that followed was not comfortable. He had the stillness of a man who did not get told no frequently and was working out how to process it. "Your sister," he said finally, "is already in my orbit. That happened before you signed anything." "I know that, but she doesn't have to go further." She held his gaze. "This is my one non-negotiable. Everything else I will work with. This one I won't move on." He looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. "It came out like it cost him something small but real. I'll arrange something less visible for her." She nodded. And then, because she was paying attention to the room the way Sylvie had told her to pay attention, she looked at the shelves of files. At the tabs she could barely read from this distance, the names of things she couldn't quite make out. At one folder near the end of the third shelf that was slightly offset from the others, like someone had pulled it recently and replaced it in slight haste. She looked away before he saw her looking. The next morning she found Sylvie in the kitchen early while the house was quiet and said simply, "Tell me what I should know." Sylvie looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. Then she set it down. "I've worked here 15 years, she said. "The 4 years before that, I worked for the uncle. Lucien." She said the name without inflection. "When Mr. Vescari, Damian, took over primary operations, I asked to transfer. He agreed without asking why." Tessa waited. "I have never," Sylvie said, "asked myself whether that was the right choice. I know it was." She picked up her cup again. "There is a photograph. In the 4th floor study. You haven't been up there." It wasn't a question. "There's a woman in it. Dark hair, maybe 30 in the picture. She appears in 6 or 7 of the family photographs from that period, and then she doesn't." "The woman he was going to marry," Tessa said. "Mara." Sylvie's eyes did something that wasn't quite surprise. "You know about her." Elena Marsh mentioned the name. Sylvie turned her cup slowly in her hands. "There was a leak," she said, "in the organization about 8 years ago. Information about a specific shipment, a legitimate one, pharmaceuticals worth several million, reached the wrong people. The shipment was intercepted. 2 men who were escorting it were killed." She paused. "Damian believed Mara gave that information. She denied it until the day she left. He believed what he believed, and she left the country, and that was the end of it." Another pause, longer. "I have never been entirely certain he was right." Tessa felt the thing she'd been building in her mind shift its shape slightly, the way a structure does when you understand one more thing about its foundations. "Is there anyone else who might have been able to access that information at the time?" Sylvie looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said, "there is." And she picked up her coffee cup and her cloth and moved to the other side of the kitchen, and did not say anything else. That afternoon, Tessa went to the room with the files. She knew it was a line she was crossing. She crossed it anyway because 12 years in emergency medicine had taught her that the information you need in a crisis is rarely the information someone volunteers, and she had the bone-certain feeling sitting under her ribs like a cold stone that she was inside a crisis that was still in its early stages. The folder she'd noticed was labeled with a date, 7 years ago, and a case number that meant nothing to her. But inside it were financial records, pages of them. And she was not a forensic accountant, but she had paid her own bills and reconciled her own accounts for 12 years, and she knew what money moving looked like. And what she was looking at was money moving in directions that didn't correspond to each other. Transfers between entities with names she didn't recognize, channeled through a sequence of accounts that looped back on each other in a way that seemed designed to be difficult to follow. She photographed 12 pages with her phone before she heard footsteps in the corridor. She had the folder back on the shelf before the door opened. It was one of Damian's security men, not looking for her specifically, just making rounds. And he glanced in, registered her presence, and moved on without speaking. She stood in the room alone for a moment after. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to, and she pressed one hand flat against the shelf and breathed through it the way she breathed through bad moments in the trauma bay. In for 4, hold, out for 4, until the numbers in her body came back down. Then she took out her phone and looked at what she'd photographed. The transactions she couldn't trace led in various directions, but one sequence, 8 transfers, each routed through a different intermediary, terminated in an account flagged in the file with a handwritten note. Meridian Group receipt confirmed. Meridian Group. The name the man in the car had given her. The people who had taken Lena. Her hand was very still on the phone. She stared at the account number at the end of that chain of transfers and thought about what it meant. Thought about the various ways it could mean what it looked like it meant, and the various ways it could mean something else entirely, and the fact that she was standing in a house that belonged to the man whose name was at the top of this organization, looking at evidence that appeared to suggest he had financed the people who kidnapped her sister. She thought about Lena on a zip-tied chair. She thought about Lena's face that had stopped hoping. She thought about a man sitting at a desk at 2 a.m. in a car in a parking garage, looking at her with eyes that processed without reacting and saying, "I don't compel. That's not my method." She thought about Sylvie, who had transferred out of Lucian's service without being asked why, and who had said there is someone else who might have been able to access that information and then stopped. She thought about Damian Vescari in the study, warm-eyed, charming, arranging things, knowing everyone worth knowing, saying Elena knows everyone and she talks, saying it pleasantly, in the voice of a man who understands the value of controlling what information moves through which mouths. Tessa stood in that room for 4 more minutes. She built it as carefully as she could with what she had. She thought, if someone wanted to frame Damian, these records are exactly what they would create. And she thought, but if Damian did this, these records are exactly what would exist. And she held both possibilities and understood that she could not resolve them with what she currently had, and that trying to resolve them prematurely would be more dangerous than sitting with the uncertainty. She needed more. She needed to know who had access to those accounts 8 years ago, and 7, and now. She needed to know what the connection was between Meridian Group and whoever had financed them, and she needed to know it without triggering whatever alarm would go off if Damian or Lucien realized she was looking. She put her phone in her pocket and left the room and went back to her floor and sat on her bed and looked at the garden through the window for a very long time. That evening, one of Damian's senior advisors, a man named Roth, who she'd been briefly introduced to and who had the careful, watchful quality of someone paid to notice everything, did not appear for the nightly operational meeting. She knew about the meetings only because Sylvie had mentioned them in passing. She knew Roth's absence was significant only because of the quality of Damian's face when he came out of the meeting room an hour later and stood in the corridor for a moment, very still, looking at nothing. She almost didn't say anything. Then she said, "What happened?" He looked at her. "Roth hasn't reported in since this morning." "Is that—" "It's not normal," he said. His jaw was tight. "He's been with this organization 11 years. She looked at him. "Do you think he left voluntarily?" Damian's eyes went to her with a directness that felt like a door opening slightly. "No," he said, "I don't." And for a moment, in the corridor of that expensive, quiet house, he looked exactly like what he was underneath all the control, a man who had been losing things for a long time and was getting very tired of it. The message arrived at 11:47 that night. It came to Damian's secure line, but he showed it to her. She didn't know why, whether it was instinct or testing her or something he hadn't named yet, and she read it on his phone standing in the doorway of the study, in the particular silence of a house where everyone else was asleep. The message contained one image, Roth clearly alive in what looked like a storage facility, and 3 words beneath it. "She told us." Tessa read the message twice. Then she looked up at Damian. His face had gone very still, the way faces go still when the thing they were dreading has just arrived. "She," Tessa said. "They mean me." His eyes met hers. And what she saw there was not accusation yet. Not quite. But it was the thing that comes right before accusation, the moment when someone who has been hurt before begins reaching for the familiar shape of betrayal because it is the shape they already know how to hold. And she understood with absolute cold clarity that she was standing at the edge of something and that the next few seconds would determine which side of it she ended up on. She held his gaze and did not look away. That was the first decision. Not dramatic, not announced. Just a choice made in the space of one breath. She would not look away from him, because looking away was what guilty people did. And she was not guilty, and she would not perform guilt to manage his comfort. "Say what you're thinking," she said. Damian set the phone down on his desk. He did it carefully, the way you set something down when your hands want to do something else. The message implies an internal source gave Roth's location and movements to whoever took him. "And I'm the newest variable in your organization," Tessa said. "So I'm the obvious candidate." "You're one candidate." "But the most convenient one." She crossed her arms. "Not defensive. Cold. I've been in this house 9 days. I've attended one event. I have access to 3 rooms and a garden I haven't used. Walk me through exactly what you think I gave them, and when." The muscle along his jaw moved. "I don't know yet." "Then don't make the accusation until you do." Her voice came out harder than she intended, and she let it stay hard. "I understand why I look like the answer. I understand the geometry of it. But you hired me, and I use that word deliberately, because I had no entanglements in this world. If I were working for someone on the other side, the price they would have had to pay to get me in here would have to be extraordinary, and that kind of approach takes months of setup, not 72 hours. He was very still. "Unless your sister's kidnapping was the setup." The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Tessa felt the blow land, because it was a real hit, a smart one. The exact thought she'd already had at 3 a.m. 3 nights ago, lying on a bed that wasn't hers, and the fact that she'd considered it and discarded it didn't make it hurt less to hear spoken aloud by someone who was looking at her like a problem to be solved. "Yes," she said. "I've thought about that. If someone engineered Lena's kidnapping to create a pressure point that would get me inside your walls, that would require knowing that you would make this offer to me specifically, which means they'd need to know about your arrangement breaking down, and they'd need to know you would choose me as a replacement, and they'd need to know the timing down to a margin of days." She paused. "How many people knew your previous arrangement fell through?" Something shifted in his expression. He hadn't expected her to follow the logic that far. "Limited number," he said. "How limited?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to his desk and sat down, and she understood that the sitting down was its own kind of concession, that he was choosing to think rather than react, and that this cost him something because reacting was faster, and he was a man who had learned that speed was survival. "Marcus," he said. "Lucienne, 2 members of my security team. And Roth," she said. His eyes came up to her. "Roth would have known," she said quietly, "if he had operational oversight." The silence that followed was a different kind than before. Not the silence of accusation, but the silence of a calculation running. "Go to your room," he said. Not cruel, not cold, just the voice of a man who needed her out of the space while he thought. "I'm not accusing you, but I need you out of this room right now." She went. She sat on her bed and looked at the photographs she'd taken of the financial records on her phone, and she thought about Roth, who had been with the organization 11 years and was now in a photograph in a storage facility, alive, with a caption that pointed at her. She thought about who benefits. She thought about who had access to both the information about Damian's previous arrangement and the operational details of Roth's movements, and she thought about warm eyes in a study and a man who knew everyone worth knowing and understood the value of controlling what moved through which mouths. She opened a search on her phone. Looked up the name Meridian Group, knowing she'd find nothing useful in public records, and looking anyway, because sometimes the shape of the nothing tells you something. She found a defunct import company registered in Delaware, dissolved 4 years ago. 2 LLC shells beneath it, both similarly defunct. A paper trail that had been built to be followed to exactly nowhere. She went back to the financial photographs, looked at the chain of accounts again, looked at the handwriting on the note that said Meridian Group receipt, confirmed. She'd assumed the file was Damian's because it was in a room in Damian's house, but the handwriting on that note wasn't the handwriting on the other notations in the folder. She looked at them side by side and was sure of it. Different pen pressure, different letter formation, the G in group looping in a way that the G in other handwritten notes in the same folder did not. 2 different people had added things to this file. She sat with that for a long time. At 7 in the morning, Sylvie brought coffee without being asked and set it on the desk in Tessa's room and looked at her with the expression of someone who has already registered everything that happened overnight and has decided how much of it to acknowledge. "He didn't sleep," Sylvie said. "Neither did I," Tessa said. Sylvie nodded. "Mr. Lucien arrived an hour ago." Tessa looked up from her phone. "Here? This early?" "He comes when there's a crisis," Sylvie said. "He has always come when there's a crisis." She said it without tone, without indication of what she meant, and picked up the empty water glass from Tessa's nightstand and left. Tessa drank the coffee. Then she dressed. Practical, dark, the kind of clothes she thought of as working clothes, and went downstairs. She could hear voices behind the study door, Damian's and Lucienne's, the rhythms distinct even through solid wood, Damian's clipped and low, Lucienne's more expansive, the measured cadence of someone who is very comfortable constructing arguments. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then she kept walking, past the study, toward the kitchen, because walking past the study was not where she needed to be right now. She needed Marcus Hale. She found him in the small office off the east corridor that he used when he was at the house, which was apparently often enough that it had become his space in a functional sense. Papers organized in his particular way, the reading glasses on the desk, a half-drunk cup of tea that smelled like it had gone cold. He was on the phone when she appeared in the doorway, and he ended the call with the particular speed of a man who has been waiting for an interruption to arrive. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." She moved into the room and closed the door behind her. 2 things. 1. The financial records in the room off the main corridor, 3rd shelf. Someone other than Damian added notations to at least 1 file. I need to know whose handwriting that would be. She watched his face. His face did something very controlled and very fast. 2. When did Lucien find out about the previous arrangement falling through? Before or after you were told? Marcus took his glasses off, put them back on. "Where are you getting this?" he said. "I'm getting it from paying attention," she said, which is apparently something this organization has needed someone to do for a while. He looked at her for a long moment. The quality of the look was different from any look he'd given her during their briefing sessions. Less managerial, more honest. The way people look when they are deciding whether they are still managing a situation or whether the situation has outgrown management. The handwriting would be Lucien's, he said finally. He had shared access to operational files until 3 years ago, when Damian restructured the internal documentation system. But old files weren't necessarily updated, Tessa said. No, Marcus said. They weren't. He had access to Meridian Group, she said. Not a question. Marcus was very still. Why are you saying that name to me? Because it appears in a file with Lucien's handwriting on it, and because Meridian Group is the name of the people who took my sister, and because I think you have known or suspected something for a long time and have been too careful to say it. She looked at him directly. Am I wrong? The silence stretched. Outside the door, somewhere in the house, she heard a door open and close. Lucien's voice, briefly, in the corridor, moving away. No, Marcus said. He said it quietly, like a thing he was putting down after carrying it for too long. You're not wrong. She stayed in the small office with Marcus for 40 minutes. What he told her came out slowly, the way things come out when someone has been very careful for a very long time and is now deciding, for reasons he might not fully understand himself, to stop being careful. He had suspected for 2 years that a secondary financial structure existed beneath the organization's legitimate operations. He had found irregularities, small ones, the kind that could always be explained by legitimate complexity, and had documented them privately and had not brought them to Damian because he could not prove the source, and bringing an accusation against Damian Vescari without proof would be, in his precise words, an extremely efficient way to be wrong in a permanent sense. He's been positioning for something, Marcus said. I don't know the full shape of it, but the Halverson Gala, the people Lucien wanted Damian to meet, the alliances he was facilitating, they aren't Damian's natural allies. They're old network, old money tied to operations Damian has been moving away from for 2 years. A coup. Tessa said. Marcus looked at his desk. A managed transition, more elegant. Damian stays in place as a figure, a face, but the operational control moves. The alliances Lucien is building would allow that kind of restructure. And a political marriage, Tessa said, one that Lucien arranged the need for. Marcus's eyes came to her. The previous arrangement falling through, she said. Was that genuinely her decision, or was there pressure? He took his glasses off again and set them on the desk and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. I don't know, he said. I've wondered. She thought about the woman who'd made a different calculation about risk. She thought about whether the calculation had been made freely or whether something had been put on one side of the scale. He needed Damian to need something, she said. Something that would put Damian in a visible public position, committed to a specific social presentation at a specific time, while Lucien managed the introductions, while Lucien controlled the room. And if the wife were also… Marcus stopped. A liability, Tessa finished. Someone he could point to. Someone without history in this world, without established loyalty, who could be made to look like a source. She felt it settling into place, the terrible clean logic of it. He didn't need me to actually be a spy. He just needed it to be plausible. He needed Damian to believe it long enough for the accusation to do its work. She left Marcus's office and walked back toward the study with the particular quality of motion that she recognized in herself from the worst moments in the trauma bay. Not rushed, not slow, just exact, each step going somewhere instead of moving for the sake of moving. She was not afraid. She was clear in the way that emergencies make you clear. All the noise dropped away and only the necessary things remaining. She opened the study door. Damian was alone. He was standing at the window, the same window she'd first seen Lucien standing at. And he turned when the door opened and his expression went through 3 things very fast before settling on something carefully neutral. I need 10 minutes, she said. Tessa, 10 minutes. Then you can do whatever you've decided to do. But 10 minutes first. He looked at her. Then he gestured to the chair across from his desk. She didn't sit. She stood in the middle of the room and told him what she'd found and what Marcus had told her in the order that made the most logical sense, without editorializing, the way she reported to attending physicians. Facts, sequence, conclusion. She watched his face while she talked. He gave her very little, which she'd expected, but she was watching for the specific thing. The moment when something she said landed against something he already knew, the small, involuntary quality of recognition, and she saw it twice. Once when she named the handwriting on the file. Once when she said the phrase managed transition. When she finished, the room was quiet. He hadn't moved. He was looking at a point on the desk that wasn't anything in particular, and the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the controlled stillness of a man managing his reactions, but the different stillness of a man whose architecture has just taken a significant hit and is still standing but is not sure yet what it's standing on. The handwriting, he said finally. It's in the file. I can show you the photographs. I know what his handwriting looks like, he said. He said it quietly. Not to her, to himself, or to something in the room that neither of them could name. Damian. She said his name for the first time without a qualifier, without Mrs. or Mr. attached to either of them, just the name, direct. Who knew about Mara? About the leak? At the time. He looked up. You told me you believe she gave information about the pharmaceutical shipment, Tessa said. The 2 men who were killed. Who else had access to that shipment's details? His jaw tightened. That was 8 years ago. I know. Who had access? Operational inner circle, he said. Roth, Marcus, 2 men who are no longer with the organization, and… He stopped. She waited. And Lucien, he said. The word came out like something pulled out of a wound. He sat down in his chair. Tessa had not seen him sit like that before, not in command, not organizing the room around himself, just a man sitting because his legs had made the decision before he did. Lucien pointed me toward Mara, he said. When the leak was identified, he brought me the first evidence. His voice was very flat. I thought he was protecting the organization. The silence between them was immense. She let him have it. She didn't move toward him or away from him, didn't offer anything, because she understood, from 12 years of sitting with people in the worst moments of their lives, that some grief needs to exist in a space without being managed. He had loved Mara. Whatever else was true about him and about that time, he had loved her, and he had believed for 8 years that she had betrayed him, and now he was sitting with the possibility that the betrayal had been someone else's, and that he had simply been the instrument of it. She watched his hands on the desk. They were completely still, which cost him more than anything else she'd seen from him. "I need to get the encrypted files off this property," she said when she thought the silence had run its course. "What I found is a fragment. If Lucien has been building a secondary financial structure for years, there will be more, full records, probably stored off-site or in an encrypted network. If we can access that, he said. She met his eyes. Yes, we. She said it without apology. "I'm inside this now, Damian. I was inside it before I walked into your car in that parking garage. I just didn't know it yet. So yes, we." Something moved across his face. Not the quarter second of realness she'd catalogued before. Not the longer something she'd seen by the window. But a third thing, deeper. The specific look of a person who has been alone inside something very heavy for a very long time and has just registered the possibility that they might not have to carry it that way anymore. He didn't say anything, but he nodded. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face went to stone. He answered. Tessa watched him listen for 15 seconds, during which his expression did not change at all, which was its own terrible kind of change. He lowered the phone, looked at her. "Lucien called a session," he said. "Outer council, an hour from now." "What does that mean?" "It means he's moving." Damian stood. His voice had gone to the level flat quality it had when he was beyond anger and operating on something colder and more functional. "An outer council session requires a formal accusation to be tabled. He's going to use the Roth situation to table an accusation against you." He paused. "Against you as a security breach. Presented to the council, it forces my hand publicly. I'd have to respond to it within the structure, which takes time, creates distraction, and positions him as the one calling for accountability. While he's already positioned the alliances he needs," Tessa said. "Yes." She thought fast. "Then we go in first." She looked at him. "Don't give him the room. You call the session yourself 10 minutes before his." Damian looked at her. "I'd need something concrete, enough to open a formal challenge against a council member, without proof. The financial records," she said, "the photographs I took, Marcus's testimony. It's not everything, but it's enough to open the question, and opening the question publicly changes the geometry. It also," he said carefully, "puts you in a room full of people who have already been told you're the liability." She looked back at him. "Let me worry about the room," she said. The outer council convened in a formal room on the ground floor she hadn't entered before. Dark paneling, a long table, 8 people she'd seen once or never. They came in with the air of people who have been summoned to something they are not surprised by, but are performing surprise for social reasons. Lucien was already seated when Tessa and Damian entered together, and the micro-expression that crossed Lucien's face when he saw them walk in side by side lasted less than a second, but she caught it, and she was quite sure Damian did too, because Damian's hand moved to the back of her chair with a deliberateness that was not comfort. It was declaration. Lucien recovered instantly, warm, concerned. "I wasn't expecting," he began. "I know," Damian said. He sat. "I'm calling this session, not you." The room went very still. Tessa placed her phone on the table in front of her. She'd transferred the photographs to a tablet that Marcus had encrypted and brought to the room, and the tablet was open in front of Damian. She watched Lucien's eyes go to it, and watched his face perform the elaborate nothing of a man who knows what he is looking at and is deciding in real time how to respond. Damian laid it out with the directness she'd seen him use in every conversation that mattered. No preamble, no softening, just the sequence of facts in the order that made their meaning impossible to misread. The financial records, the Meridian Group connection, the Meridian Group's relationship to the kidnapping of Tessa's sister, the timing of Roth's disappearance against the timeline of Lucian's movements. The message, she told us, and the absence of any operational detail that Tessa actually had access to that would have been worth sending. She watched the council while Damian spoke, watched the faces. Two of them, a man named Calloway and a woman whose name she'd been told and couldn't retrieve, looked at Lucian before they looked at Damian when the Meridian connection was named, which told her exactly what she needed to know about where their positioning was. Lucian waited until Damian finished. Then he smiled. Not the warm smile, a different one, smaller, the one you use when you have decided the performance is no longer necessary. "This is an impressive document," he said. "It's also been in this building for years, in a room that your wife has had access to for 9 days. He looked at Tessa. "I find it interesting that these concerns surface now, from this particular source." "The handwriting is yours," Damian said. "My handwriting appears in dozens of files from my operational period," Lucian said. "That's not surprising. That's history. The Meridian account is flagged in your notation. I flagged many accounts for monitoring. That's due diligence." He spread his hands, the gesture of a man completely at ease. "Damian, I understand that you trust her. I understand why. She's compelling, she's intelligent, and she came to you in a moment of vulnerability that created a bond that feels real." His voice was entirely kind. "But consider the sequence. Her sister is taken. You bring her in. Within 2 weeks, Roth is compromised, and the evidence that surfaces points, by this woman's own presentation, toward me. The timing isn't suspicious to you?" Tessa looked at Lucian. Looked at him with 12 years of reading people who were trying very hard to be something they weren't, and she said, "You have a recording." Lucian blinked. One blink. It was enough. "I'm sorry?" "The message that came to Damian's secure line last night. She told us. You needed Damian to receive it, which means you needed to know the line was active and that the message would reach him within a specific window." She leaned forward slightly. "A message like that comes from someone with positional awareness, someone who knows the line's security protocols and knew Damian would be at his desk. That narrows it to inner circle." She paused. "And the phrasing. She told us. Present tense. Not she is the source or we have reason to believe. She told us as if confirming something that was asked, which means there was a prior communication, a setup, someone priming the recipient for a specific answer." She held his eyes. "You set the table before you served the message." The room was absolutely silent. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. The warmth was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was not rage. It was something worse, assessment, the look of a man recalculating from scratch. "You're smarter than I planned for," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a problem statement. "I know," she said. And then Calloway stood up on Lucian's side of the table, and the woman whose name Tessa couldn't retrieve reached for her phone, and the room that had been still began to move in ways that had nothing to do with conversation anymore. And Damian's hand came down on her arm, not gently, and said, "We need to go." They were 3 steps from the door when Lucian's voice came from behind them, very quiet, very precise, cutting through the noise of the room the way a sharp thing cuts. "Your sister, Tessa. I should tell you, she isn't where you think she is anymore." Tessa stopped. She turned. Lucian was standing now, unhurried, his hands in his pockets, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been playing a longer game than anyone in the room understood and has just shown the hand that ends it. "I gave you 9 days," he said. "That was generous, I think. Considerate, even." His eyes moved to Damian. "You should have taken the political arrangement I offered you in January. This would have been so much cleaner." The door at the far end of the room opened. 2 men came through it that Tessa didn't recognize. Not Damian's team, not anyone she'd seen in 9 days of careful attention. And the quality of the room changed in the way that rooms change when everyone understands simultaneously that the meeting has ended and something else has begun. Damian stepped in front of her. She put her hand on his arm and stepped back to his side, because she was not going to stand behind anyone in this room, not now, and she felt him register it without looking at her, felt the slight change in his stance that acknowledged she was there and accounted for her. She looked at Lucian across the table. She looked at his face and thought about Lena on a zip-tied chair, and thought about a man who had spent 8 years believing the wrong thing about a woman he'd loved because this man had handed him the wrong evidence. And she thought about all the things that Lucien had moved and arranged and positioned over years and decades to arrive at this specific moment, this room, these two men at the door, and she thought about the fact that she had been inside this building for 9 days. And she already knew where 3 of the exits were and which 2 were unwatched after 10 p.m. and where the backup communications equipment was kept, because she had paid attention and paid attention and paid attention, and now she was going to need every single thing she had learned. "Where is she?" Tessa said. Lucien looked at her with something that was almost respect, the way you might respect a problem that is more complex than you initially estimated. "That," he said pleasantly, "is entirely up to how the next conversation goes." And Tessa looked at Damian, and Damian looked at her, and in that half second between what had been and what was coming, with 2 men at the door and 6 people in the room, and Lucien standing at the head of it all, like a man who had spent 30 years building toward exactly this moment, she made the decision that she had been moving toward since a parking garage at 2 in the morning, when she had answered a phone she almost didn't pick up. And the decision was this: she was not going to survive this by being careful anymore. The 2 men at the door moved at the same time. Damian moved faster. He crossed the distance to the nearer one in 4 steps, and the economy of it. No warning, no posturing, just the sudden absolute commitment of a man who has decided that the conversation is over, was something Tessa had not seen before and filed immediately into the category of things she needed to account for. The man went down hard against the doorframe. The second one reached inside his jacket, and Tessa was already moving, not toward him, but sideways, because she had registered the table between her and Calloway and used it, shoved it hard into Calloway's path as he came around his side. The table caught him at the hip. He went off balance. She didn't wait to see the rest. She grabbed the tablet off the floor where it had slid and went through the door Damian had just cleared. The corridor outside was empty for approximately 3 seconds. Then it wasn't. Damian pulled her left by the arm, not rough, just directional. The grip of someone who knows where they're going and is communicating it through contact rather than words, because words take time. She matched his pace. They went through a service corridor she'd walked once during her first day orientation and hadn't thought about since, and she was grateful now for the habit she hadn't known she was building, paying attention, paying attention, paying attention, because she knew there was a stairwell at the end of it, and she knew the stairwell went down. "Car," she said, working on it. He had his phone to his ear. Short exchange, 2 sentences, a name she didn't catch. Then he lowered it. 2 minutes. Lucien's people will have the front. I know. Side exit off the kitchen corridor. He looked at her sideways while they moved. You memorized the exits. First week, old habit. She didn't elaborate. He didn't ask. They came out through the kitchen into the narrow service alley behind the brownstone. The air was cold and tasted like exhaust and standing water, the smell of the city's underside, and it hit her face like a reset, sharp, functional, grounding. A black car was already at the alley entrance, engine running, not the usual driver. A man she'd seen once in Damian's security rotation, compact and quiet, who opened the rear door without speaking. They were moving inside 40 seconds. She sat in the back with the tablet on her knees and her heart doing something loud in her chest that she was managing by ignoring it, which was a method that worked until it didn't. Damian was on the phone again. She listened to the shape of his side of the conversation, the controlled terseness of it, the specific way he said 2 names and then went quiet while he listened, and she was reading Lucien's council room back in her mind, cataloging what she'd seen, Calloway and the woman, definitely pre-positioned, 2 more she wasn't sure about, 3 who had looked at Damian first, not Lucien, when the records were named, which was something. Marcus, she said. Damian lowered the phone. Safe. He left through the east side before Lucien's men got there. He needs to get to a clean line and pull everything he has on Lucien's secondary accounts, she said. The fragments I photographed are enough to open a challenge. But if Lucien controls the council room and controls the narrative for the next 6 hours, a challenge won't be enough. We need the full structure, the real money, the real connections. I know what we need, he said. Not sharp, just accurate. Where would he keep it? She said. The real records, not the brownstone. That's already compromised territory. He knew we'd find fragments, something off-site, something he controls independently. Damian looked out the window. The city moved past them at the speed of someone with places to be, indifferent, relentless. He has a building, he said slowly. Waterfront, Red Hook, old shipping terminal. He bought it 15 years ago, supposedly for redevelopment. Nothing was ever developed. He paused. I stopped asking about it years back because he had a reasonable cover story, and I had other concerns. Tessa looked at him. He kept it empty for 15 years. Or he kept it useful. That's where Lena is, she said. He met her eyes. She watched him run the same logic she'd already run. Lucien needed a location that was his, independently secured, outside Damian's operational awareness, large enough to function as both storage and containment. A shipping terminal with controlled access and 15 years of plausible nothing covering it. Yes, he said. Probably. Then that's where we go. He made 3 more calls in the next 12 minutes. She sat beside him and let him work because she understood the architecture of what he was doing, pulling threads, repositioning people, the operational reconfiguration of a man who has had the floor pulled out and is building something to stand on in real time. She watched his hands. They were steady, which told her what she needed to know about what he was made of under pressure. Her own hands were less steady. She pressed them flat on the tablet and let the cool surface of it absorb the shaking until it stopped. Damian, she said, between his second and third call. He looked at her. Lucien said something in January. A political arrangement. What was it? His jaw moved. He wanted me to formalize an alliance with a family called the Dravek Network. Eastern European operation, significant legitimate holdings as cover, significant trafficking revenue underneath. The alliance would have required a marriage, one of Dravek's daughters. It was presented as strategic. He paused. I declined. The Dravek Network's trafficking operations are exactly the kind of thing I've been dismantling for 2 years. And Lucien was positioning you toward them. He was positioning me toward them, Damian confirmed. She looked at him. He wasn't just building a coup. He was selling you to them. She said it flatly, the way you say a fact that is unpleasant but needs to exist in the open. The managed transition, it wasn't Lucien taking control. It was Lucien delivering the organization to Dravek and stepping into a senior position under their umbrella. The car was quiet for a moment. 30 years? Damian said. His voice was very controlled and completely empty of warmth. He built this organization with my father for 30 years. He looked out the window again. My father trusted him with everything. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say, and she knew the difference between useful and performed, so she stayed quiet and let him carry it. They picked up Marcus at a coffee shop in Carroll Gardens. He was sitting in the back corner with a laptop bag, and the expression of a man who has been running scenarios in his head for 2 hours and hasn't liked any of them. He slid into the front seat and turned to face them with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. I pulled what I could from the secure server before I left, he said. Not everything. The primary encrypted partition requires on-site access, but I have transaction records going back 4 years, and there are 2 accounts routing to a shell domiciled in Malta that I've never seen before. Malta connects to Dravek, Damian said. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Yes, it does. How many people in the council can we trust? Damian said. Reliably? 3. Possibly 4. Marcus named them. Tessa noted the names, noted that 2 of them had looked at Damian first in the council room, confirmed the pattern. Calloway has been Lucien's for at least 18 months. The others I'm less certain about. Scared, more likely than committed. Scared people are manageable, Tessa said. Both men looked at her. They need a reason to come back to the side with less risk. Right now, Lucien looks like the less risky option because he moved first and he has the momentum. We need to change the risk calculation before they fully commit. How? Marcus said. The encrypted records, she said. If we can access the full financial structure and get it onto a platform that council members can verify independently, not through Lucienne, not through Damian, but through an external forensic channel, the choice stops being about loyalty and starts being about evidence. Nobody wants to go down with Lucien if his entire operation is demonstrably documented. Marcus looked at her for a moment. You'd need to broadcast it through the syndicate's own encrypted network, the one all council members are connected to. Lucien's people can't intercept it if it originates from within the network's own authentication structure. Where is the authentication node? She said. Silence. It's at the terminal, Damian said quietly. He insisted on it years ago, said it was more secure than a city-based location. He said it with the particular flatness of someone assembling, in real time, the full shape of a plan they've been inside without knowing it. He put the network's core node inside his own facility. Tessa looked at him. He built his escape route into the organization's own infrastructure. Yes, Damian said. Then we're going to use it against him, she said. The Red Hook waterfront at 11 at night was the kind of place that existed in negative space. Docks that had stopped being used, warehouses that had stopped being warehouses, the East River moving dark and indifferent beyond it all. The terminal was a large industrial structure that had probably been functional in some previous decade, and now presented blank walls and a gate secured with modern hardware that looked wrong against the aged frame around it, the way new locks look on abandoned buildings, pointed, intentional, keeping something in rather than keeping people out. Damian's team was 4 people. She'd met 2 of them. The other 2 were new to her, which meant they'd been kept off the primary roster deliberately, people Lucienne didn't know about, which was the only kind of person useful right now. They moved along the waterfront in the dark with the particular silence of people who have done this specific kind of thing before, and Tessa moved with them and did not pretend she was the same as them but kept pace and stayed functional, which was all she was asking of herself. Damian came up beside her at the perimeter. When we're inside, you stay with me. I need to get to the communications node, she said. I know where it is. Stay with me and we'll get there. He looked at her sideways in the dark. I mean it, Tessa. Not because I don't think you can handle yourself, because I am not dividing my attention right now. She looked at him. In the dark, with the river smell on the air and the sounds of the city muffled to a low ambient hum, his face was stripped of everything except what it actually was, tired, hard, holding something together by the specific quality of his will. Okay, she said. They went in through a loading entrance on the south side that one of the team members opened with a device Tessa didn't examine. The interior of the terminal was vast and dim, emergency lighting running at low intervals, the ceiling high and industrial above them, the smell of salt and old metal and something chemical underneath it that she couldn't place. Rows of shipping containers occupied the middle third of the space. Offices and secondary structures ran along the far wall, and there were people inside. She counted 4 visible in the first 30 seconds, moving with the purposeful quality of people who know they are on guard duty and are taking it seriously. More, probably, that she couldn't see. Lucien had had hours to mobilize, and he had used them. The next 7 minutes were the most focused of her life. She stayed behind Damian and watched how he moved through his own kind of crisis. Not reckless, not theatrical, the controlled aggression of a man who has spent his whole life in high-stakes rooms and has learned that the difference between winning and losing is usually a matter of 2 seconds and clear thinking. His team worked with him in the practiced shorthand of people who have drilled for exactly this, and she tracked their movements and tracked the guards and kept herself oriented to the floor plan she was building in her head in real time. They found Roth first. He was in a secondary office on the east side, zip-tied to a chair, a detail that hit Tessa with a specific physical resonance, and he was in rough shape but conscious, which was the only relevant fact. One of the team cut him loose. He looked at Damian and said, "The north structure," which were apparently the only 3 words needed because Damian's jaw tightened and he looked at Tessa and said, "Lena's in the north structure," and she was already moving. The north structure was a partitioned section of the terminal, a room within a room, with a door that was locked with the same new hardware as the front gate. One of the team dealt with it. Tessa went through first. Lena was there, seated, not zip-tied this time, just a locked room, a cot, a water bottle. She looked up when the door opened and her face did the thing Tessa had been holding in her chest like a coal for hours. The absolute open relief of someone who had been alone and afraid in the dark and has just heard a familiar voice. Tessa. Just that. The same way she'd said it on the phone from Penn Station. "I've got you," Tessa said. She crossed the room and put both hands on her sister's face and checked her. Eyes, breathing, visible injuries. The nurse's assessment running beneath the sister's presence. The two things she was simultaneously. Nothing critical, frightened and exhausted, but physically intact. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then we walk." She pulled Lena to her feet and kept one arm around her and turned to find Damian in the doorway, and she met his eyes and something passed between them that didn't need words. A recognition, a reckoning, the specific weight of two people who have just confirmed something they weren't certain they'd be able to confirm. Then the lights went out. All of them. Total dark for 2 seconds before the emergency strips kicked back in at barely functional levels. Enough to see shapes, outlines, the geometry of the space without detail. And from somewhere in the upper section of the terminal, she heard Lucian's voice over a speaker system, which told her everything about how thoroughly he'd planned this space for this possibility. "Damian," the voice said, "I want you to understand that I'm not angry. I'm genuinely not. You've always been stubborn. Your father was the same. It was one of his best qualities and one of his most dangerous ones." A pause. "But this ends tonight, one way or another. Come out of the north section, and we'll talk." Damian looked at her. His face in the emergency lighting was all shadow and edge. "He's rigged this place," he said. It wasn't a question. "Explosives," one of the team said from behind them. "I counted at least 3 sets of charges along the main structural columns. Could be more." Tessa looked at Lena. Lena looked back at her with the specific expression of someone who is frightened but is managing it because their older sister is managing it, and they have been reading that signal since childhood. "I'm okay," Lena said quietly. "Tell me what to do." "Stay behind me and move when I move," Tessa said. She turned to Damian. "The communications node. Where exactly?" "Main office structure, northeast corner, 2nd level." "How far?" 60 feet through open floor. She thought. "The charges, are they set for remote detonation or timed?" The team member. "Remote. I saw the triggers." "Then he won't detonate while he's inside," she said. "He needs to be clear of the building first, which means we have a window." "Or he detonates with people inside," Damian said. His voice was very level. "Is that who he is?" she said. Damian looked at her. "I don't know anymore," he said, and it was the most honest thing she'd heard from him, carrying 8 years of a man who thought he knew someone and is finding out, in the worst possible place, how wrong he was. "Then we move on the assumption that we have time, because the alternative is we don't move at all." She held his eyes. "Marcus has the financial fragments. If I can get to the node and push the full encrypted records through the syndicate network, every council member gets it simultaneously. Lucien loses the narrative before morning." "You'd need the network's authentication credentials," Damian said. "I have them," Marcus said from behind her. She turned. He had come in from the east office behind the team, Roth beside him moving stiffly, and Marcus was holding his laptop bag with the look of a man who has decided that this is the thing he came here to do. "I've had them for 2 years," he said. "I've been waiting for a reason to use them." He looked at Damian. "I'm sorry it took this long." Damian looked at him for a moment, then, "Don't be sorry. Be fast." They moved across 60 feet of open terminal floor with the lights at bare minimum and Lucien's guards repositioning in the dark. And it was not clean or smooth. Twice they stopped. Once someone on the team went left to create a distraction that Tessa didn't watch, because she was focused entirely on the 60 feet and on Lena's hand in hers and on the northeast corner where the 2nd level office was. She heard sounds she cataloged and filed, voices, movement, once a crash of something metal that bounced off the high ceiling and rang through the whole space, and she kept moving. They made the northeast stairs. She took them with Lena, Marcus behind her, Damian at the rear. The 2nd level office was glass-walled, overlooking the main floor, which meant the moment they turned on the equipment inside it, they would be visible to anyone below who was looking. Tessa registered this and looked at Damian, and he registered it too and said quietly to the team members with them, "Hold the stairs." They held the stairs. Marcus opened the laptop and connected to the terminal's hardwired authentication node with a cable he pulled from his bag, and his hands were shaking slightly. She could see it, and she put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Not comfort, not pressure, just contact, the grounding thing, and felt him steady. He typed with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting for this specific task for 2 years and knows exactly what to do with it. Tessa watched the main floor through the glass while he worked. Lena pressed against the wall beside her, Damian to her right, with his attention split between the stairs and the floor below. 2 minutes, Marcus said. From below, Lucien's voice again, no longer through the speaker, closer now, coming up through the floor, through the physical space. "I know where you are," he said. He sounded, she thought, almost regretful. "Damian, please understand, the organization your father built was always going to evolve past you. You're too moral for what it needs to be. I mean that as a genuine observation, not a criticism." Damian didn't answer. 1 minute, Marcus said. She looked at the floor below, could see movement now, 2 people coming toward the northeast structure. She looked at Damian. He was already looking at the stairs. Then a shot rang out. Not from inside the terminal, from somewhere outside, distant, which made no sense until her phone lit up in her pocket and she looked at it and found a text from a number she didn't have saved. "Council members Harwick and Reyes are outside with federal contacts. They received the fragment files from Marcus. They're moving now. Stall." She looked at Damian and turned the phone so he could see. Something moved across his face. Not relief. Not yet. But the first distant signal of something that might become relief if they survived the next 60 seconds. 30 seconds, Marcus said. The stairwell sounds changed. She grabbed the back of Lena's jacket and said, "Against the wall now." And Lena went against the wall, and Damian was already at the door and she was beside him, not behind him, and he didn't tell her to move back and she didn't move back, and they stood there together in the thin emergency light with the stairs beyond the glass showing movement coming up. "Done," Marcus said. His voice came out shaky with exhale. "It's transmitting. The full records are pushing to every authenticated council node simultaneously. 40 seconds to complete." 40 seconds was a long time. The stairwell door opened. 2 of Lucien's men came through, and the next 40 seconds were loud and close and extremely physical in the way that real violence always is. Nothing like distance, nothing like strategy, just the immediate brute fact of bodies in a small space making urgent decisions. She pulled Lena down behind the desk Marcus had been working at and stayed over her sister and watched Damian and the remaining team member work in the terrible compressed space of the stairwell door, and she kept her hand on Lena's back and felt her sister shaking and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. Then the transmitting bar on Marcus's screen hit 100%, and Lucien walked in. He came through the stairwell behind his own men, which told her he'd had a third access point they hadn't found, and he stood in the door of the glass office and looked at all of them, at Damian, at Tessa over the desk, at Marcus's open laptop, and he understood, in the specific way that very intelligent people understand defeat, exactly what had happened. She watched him understand it, watched his face perform, in miniature, the entire sequence, the calculation, the assessment, the search for remaining options, and then the very small, very controlled moment when he found what was left. He looked at Damian. "I loved your father," he said. And it was true. She could hear that it was true, which was the most disturbing thing he had said in any room she'd been in with him. "I loved him, and he chose you over the organization's future, and I have been correcting that mistake ever since." His hand moved toward the remote in his jacket. "Lucien?" Damian said. His voice was very quiet. "Mara." Lucien stopped. "Tell me," Damian said. "Before anything else, tell me what you did." The silence in the room was so complete she could hear the river outside, distant, continuous, indifferent to all of it. Lucien looked at his nephew, and in the quality of what crossed his face she understood, with cold absolute certainty, that he was going to tell him, not from remorse, not from confession's relief, but because he was a man who had spent 30 years as the smartest person in every room, And this was the last room, and he wanted, in the end, to be known for the full architecture of what he'd built. "She didn't betray you," Lucien said. "She would have, eventually. She was too good for this life and too honest for the organization, and she would have taken you out of it piece by piece until there was nothing left." He said it with perfect calm. "I gave the information about the shipment to the Meridian people myself. I made sure it looked like her. I thought you'd let her go. Separate. Clean. I didn't anticipate that you'd—" He paused. "You took it harder than I expected." The room was very still. Damian's face had gone completely absent of expression, which was not the same as being absent of feeling. It was the face of someone feeling something so large that the face simply cannot find a shape for it and has stopped trying. She watched his hands. They were still. The specific terrible stillness of a man who has just had 8 years rebuilt and destroyed simultaneously in the space of 30 seconds. Lucian's hand moved again toward his jacket. "The charges are set for 60 seconds from this trigger," he said. Not threatening, informing. "I need you to understand that I've thought this through completely." "Drop it," said a voice from the second stairwell door, the one they hadn't known about, and she turned to find 2 people she'd never seen in suits that were not tactical but were not casual either, and behind them a face she recognized from the council text. Harwick, council member, holding a phone and looking at Lucien with the expression of a man who has just received a complete set of financial records and has had enough time to understand what they mean. Lucy Sheen looked at Harwick, looked at his nephew, looked at the remote in his hand, and at the terminal around them, and at whatever he was seeing that none of them could see. 60 seconds, he said almost to himself, and pressed the trigger. Damian crossed the room in 2 steps and hit him with enough force to send them both into the wall, and the remote bounced across the floor and Tessa was already moving, grabbing it, looking at the count. 53 seconds, the display said, in the small red numbers of something that was never meant to be read this close. She looked at Damian. He looked at her. Lucien was down, Harwick's people moving toward him, Marcus pulling Lena toward the stairwell, and 53 seconds was not a lot of time, but it was not nothing, and she had learned, across 12 years and more close moments than she'd counted, that not nothing was always enough to work with. "Run," she said. 53 seconds. Tessa ran. She ran with the remote in her fist and Lena's hand in her other hand and the terminal around her doing what large industrial spaces do when you are trying to move through them fast, offering distances that are longer than they look, obstacles that appear at the wrong moment, surfaces that are slick where they shouldn't be. Marcus was ahead of them on the stairs, moving with the desperate efficiency of a man who has spent too many years behind a desk and is discovering what his body can do when the alternative is not doing it. Harwick's 2 people had Lucy Tien between them, one on each arm, and Lucien was moving without resistance, which was the thing that frightened her most. Not the man who fights his capture, but the man who has already calculated past it. She hit the ground floor at the bottom of the stairs and kept moving toward the south loading exit, the way they'd come in, and she was counting in her head without meaning to. 41, 40, and the terminal around her was very large, and the exit was still 30 feet away, and she thought with the specific cold clarity of someone who has spent years in emergency rooms. The charges are on the structural columns, which means the initial failure will be the roof, which means the safest vector is low and fast and out, not up. "Get down when you hear the first one," she said. To no one in particular, to everyone. They made the loading door at 31 seconds. She went through it and the night air hit her face and she turned and looked back to count heads. Marcus, Lena, Harwick's people, Luce, and between them, 2 of Damian's team. And then Damian, coming through last, and she grabbed his arm the moment he was through and said, "Move." And they moved, all of them, away from the structure and toward the water's edge, because the water's edge was the only open ground with nothing above it to come down. At 12 seconds, she pulled Lena down behind a concrete barrier at the dock's edge. She felt Damian drop beside her, his shoulder hard against hers, and she put her face against the concrete and covered her head with her arms, and felt Lena do the same beneath her. And then the first charge went, and the sound of it was not what she expected. Not one explosion, but a sequence. Structural failure running through the building like a sentence being spoken in a language made entirely of force, each charge finding the next. The terminal skeleton giving way section by section with a grinding inevitability that was somehow worse than a single detonation because it kept going, the whole structure making its long, slow decision to come down. The pressure wave hit them as a physical thing, a shove from a direction that wasn't any one direction, and debris came over and past them, and the concrete barrier absorbed what it absorbed. She had her eyes shut. She felt Lena's back under her hands, rising and falling, rising and falling. She felt Damian's shoulder still against hers. She focused on those two things and breathed through the noise and the shaking ground and the deep resonant crash of the terminal's roof going into the harbor. And then it was over. And the silence that followed was not actual silence. It was the comparative quiet of a world that had been very loud and was now only normally loud. Traffic somewhere, the river, the sound of something structural still settling. She lifted her head. The terminal was gone. Not damaged. Gone, in the categorical way that buildings go when the bones come out. What remained was low and burning at its edges, a collapsed geometry of industrial steel and concrete sending smoke up into the harbor air in a thick column that caught the ambient city light and glowed a dark orange at its base. The harbor behind it was black and moving. She looked at Lena. Lena's face had concrete dust on it, and her eyes were very wide, but she was breathing and she was looking back at Tessa, and that was all that needed to be true right now. She looked at Damian. He was sitting with his back against the concrete barrier, looking at the place where the terminal had been. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that was tracking blood down the side of his face in a slow line, and he wasn't doing anything about it. She reached into her jacket pocket on reflex and found nothing useful, which was not surprising, and pulled the sleeve of her own shirt down over her palm and pressed it against the cut the way she'd press cloth against 100 cuts in 100 rooms. And he turned and looked at her, and she held his gaze and held the pressure, and neither of them said anything. Lucien was on the ground 15 feet away with Harwick's people standing over him and his wrist secured behind him with something from one of their jacket pockets. He was looking at the wreckage of his terminal with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not satisfaction, not grief, something in between that had its own texture. He had built that place for 30 years of planning, and it had lasted 47 seconds past his trigger. She wondered if some part of him had already been done before the building fell, and whether this was the ending he'd chosen because it was the only one left that was still his to choose. Then he said, without turning to look at any of them, "There are 12 names in the Dravik Network's operational files, people who don't know they've been handed over yet." He said it to the air, to the smoke, to the harbor. "The files are in a server farm in Newark, server 4, partition 7. He paused. "I'm not telling you this for any reason except that those people haven't done anything yet, and some of them probably didn't know what they were agreeing to." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Damian said very quietly, "Marcus." Marcus, who was sitting against a piling 6 feet away and looking like a man who has just survived the longest 47 seconds of his life, heard his name and reached for his phone. The next 4 hours were a kind of controlled chaos that Tessa moved through with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided the only thing to do is the next necessary thing and then the thing after that. Federal contacts arrived, the ones Harwick had brought, and then more, the kind of rapid institutional response that happens when a sufficient quantity of documented financial crimes hits enough secure networks simultaneously. She answered questions with the directness she used in patient intake, factual, sequential, relevant only. She kept Lena beside her through most of it, one hand periodically on her sister's back, the nurse's habit of monitoring what you can't fully assess. Lena sat through it with the particular endurance of someone who has already been through the worst part and is now simply waiting for the machinery around it to complete. She didn't ask many questions. She watched Damian periodically with the careful attention of a younger sibling who is trying to understand the full shape of a decision their older sister made and is not yet sure they have all the pieces. At 3 a.m, a federal agent named Souza, steady, businesslike, with the manner of someone who has processed complicated situations for long enough that complication no longer rattles them, sat across from Tessa in the back of a vehicle and asked her to walk through the sequence of the financial records and what she'd found and when. She walked through it. He listened with the quality of attention that good investigators have, the kind that is not just hearing, but filing, connecting, building. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment and said, "You were in this house for 9 days?" "Yes," she said. He looked at his notes. "You identified the secondary financial structure, the Meridian connection, and the council infiltration in 9 days, working without any investigative resources." "I was paying attention," she said. He looked up at her. "We've had a file on the Vescari organization for 4 years," he said. He said it without accusation, just as information offered in exchange for what she'd given him. "We didn't have any of this." She thought about Sylvie saying things worth noticing. She thought about Marcus carrying 2 years of documented suspicion in a laptop bag. She thought about the specific quality of a system that has learned to protect itself so well from outside that it cannot see what grows inside. "I know," she said. "I think that's how he kept it running for 30 years. Sousa nodded slowly. "The server farm in Newark. Vescari told you about it." "Lucien told us," she said, voluntarily, before he was formally in custody. "Why do you think he did that?" She looked out the vehicle window. The harbor was still smoking at the edge of her sightline, a thin column now, less orange, cooling toward gray. "I think," she said carefully, "that he built this very carefully for a very long time, and at the end of it he wanted someone to understand what it was." She paused. "The 12 names. He could have kept that. It had no strategic value left. The building was gone. The records were distributed. He didn't need to give them up." She looked back at Sousa. "I think there were things he did that he knew were not recoverable, and things he did that he thought he could still account for. That was one of the latter." Sousa considered this. "You have an interesting way of looking at people." "I work in emergency medicine," she said. "You learn to look at what's actually there instead of what you expected to find." The Newark server farm was raided before dawn. 12 names, as promised, and then 40 beyond them. The operational depth of the Dravik network's trafficking infrastructure, the shell companies, the routing accounts, the contacts in 3 states who had been providing transport and documentation. The raid moved through federal channels with the speed that happens when paperwork has already been done and decisions have already been made at levels that don't need to be explained. And by 6 in the morning, Tessa was reading the preliminary reports on Marcus's laptop in a hotel room that Harwick had arranged, with Lena asleep on the bed behind her, and Damian sitting in the chair across the room with his cut cleaned and closed with the butterfly strips she'd found in the hotel's first aid kit, looking at his own phone with the expression of a man working through a very long list. "Calloway," he said. She looked up. He turned over voluntarily at 4 a.m., provided documentation on the council members who were pre-positioned with Lucien. He set the phone down. 3 of them. Full cooperation in exchange for terms. "And the organization," she said. He looked at her. The word organization carried everything they both understood it carried. The thing his father had built. The thing Lucien had shaped and then tried to take. The thing Damian had been quietly, incrementally trying to move away from for 2 years. "What's left of it," he said, "is mine to decide what to do with." "What are you going to do with it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, working toward it, the way he did everything, deliberately. "There are 18 legitimate business interests inside the Vescari holdings: security consulting, logistics, 2 real estate firms, a technology company, all of them actual businesses, generating actual revenue." He picked up his phone and set it down again. "The other operations, everything that isn't those. I'm going to take apart." He said it simply, not for effect. "It's going to take time, and it's going to cost more than I can calculate right now. But I know what that infrastructure looks like. I've been looking at it from the inside for 8 years, and I know what it does to people who get caught in it." His eyes moved to Lena's sleeping form on the bed. "I know now in a way I couldn't make myself not know anymore." She looked at him, looked at the cut above his eyebrow, at the tiredness that had settled into him at some depth beyond the surface, at the specific quality of a man who has arrived at a decision not because it's easy, but because he can see what the alternatives cost. "That's going to make you a lot of enemies," she said. "I already have a lot of enemies." "More," she said, from inside. "Yes." He met her eyes. but fewer from the direction I actually care about. She wasn't sure for a moment what he meant by that. And then she was sure, and she looked at her hands on the laptop keyboard and said nothing. Because the room was very quiet and Lena was asleep 3 feet away, and some things need to exist in a space before they need to be spoken. Lena slept for 6 hours. When she woke, Tessa was sitting on the edge of the bed, and Damian was gone. Not far, she knew. He was in the adjacent room on calls that would probably last the rest of the day. And Lena sat up and looked at her sister with the eyes of someone who has had enough sleep to process what she was too exhausted to process before. "Tell me everything," Lena said. So Tessa told her. All of it, in the order it happened, leaving nothing out except the things that were not hers to share. She watched her sister's face move through the story. The anger, the disbelief, the moment when Lena's jaw tightened and she said, "He used my debt," meaning Lucienne, meaning that her desperation had been a tool in someone else's architecture. And Tessa said, "Yes," and let that sit because it deserved to sit. When she finished, Lena was quiet for a while. She was looking at the window, at the morning light coming through the gap in the curtains, and her expression had the particular quality of someone taking inventory of what they have left after something has been taken. "I kept trying to handle it myself," Lena said finally. "The loan. I kept thinking I was 1 week away from fixing it, and I didn't want to admit I wasn't." "I know. I should have called you." "You should have," Tessa said. "But I also should have made it easier to call me. I made it very clear for a long time that I had everything under control and didn't need help, which is not exactly an invitation." Lena looked at her. "You were taking care of everything." "I was taking care of everything in a way that made it seem like needing help was a problem," Tessa said. "Those are different things." Lena was quiet again. Then, "He's not what I expected." "Damian." Tessa looked at her. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone scarier or colder." Lena picked at the edge of the hotel bed sheet. "He doesn't look at you like a contract." Tessa didn't answer that. "Tessa?" "I'm aware of how he looks at me," she said. "Are you aware of how you look at him?" She was quiet. She looked at the window, at the same morning light Lena had been looking at, and thought about all the things she had been so precise and careful about. The contract, the terms, the 18 months, the clean separation, the money that was supposed to restart a life she would go back to. She thought about the parking garage and the study and the anteroom and the dock's edge with his shoulder hard against hers and the butterfly strips she'd put over his cut with the same hands she'd used to take his pulse in her head every time he walked into a room, the nurse in her cataloging, the rest of her doing something less clinical and more complicated. "We have a contract," she said. "Contracts end," Lena said. "This one has a specific term." "Tessa." Lena's voice was patient, the way younger siblings are patient when they have been watching their older sibling be carefully obtuse about something obvious for too long. "I was in a room with you and him for about 4 hours total, and I could see it from there." Tessa stood up. "Get dressed," she said. "I'll find us food." She found Damian in the adjacent room, which was smaller than theirs and had the look of a room that had been used for work. Papers, open laptop, the hotel coffee maker running on what was probably its 3rd cycle. He was on the phone and he raised 2 fingers when she appeared in the doorway, which she took to mean 2 minutes, and she leaned against the doorframe and waited. He finished the call. Looked at her. "Lena." "Awake." "Good." She looked at the papers on the desk without reading them. "Sousa is going to want a formal statement from her." "I know. I've arranged for her to have independent counsel present. Someone I trust, genuinely trust, not organizationally." He said the distinction carefully, the way he was saying everything this morning, with the precision of a man who has just spent 8 years learning what it costs to be imprecise about who he trusts. She doesn't need to do anything in the next 48 hours except rest. She'll want to go back to her apartment. Her apartment is fine. I had a team there last night, just to check. He paused. Not surveilling, checking. She looked at him. "Thank you. Don't." "I'm going to anyway." He looked at her. He was tired in a way that had stopped trying to hide itself, and the cut above his eyebrow was visible, and the tiredness was visible, and the complicated arithmetic of everything he was carrying was visible, and she thought, this is probably the most honest I've seen him look. And the most honest is also when he looks the most like someone she could know, actually know, past the geometry of a contract and a situation and a bargain made at 2 a.m. in a car in a parking garage. The contract, he said. She looked at him. The terms stand, he said. Whatever happens with the organization and the legal process and everything else, the terms of what we agreed to are still mine to honor. You can leave whenever you need to. The arrangement the contract specifies. Damian, she said. He stopped. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, the same configuration they'd been in a dozen times. And she looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at him in the study in the dark, the night of the gala, and said, I don't want to talk about the contract. He looked at her. What do you want to talk about? I want to talk about the fact that I've been paying attention to you for 18 days, she said. And I know what you look like when you're managing something versus when you're actually in it. And since approximately dock level last night, you've stopped managing and started being in it, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with that information. He was very still. I'm not making a declaration, she said. I'm not asking you for one. I'm just telling you what I see, because I've spent a lot of time in this situation being told to manage what I see and what I know, and I've decided that I'm not going to do that anymore. She held his eyes. You don't trust easily. That's not a criticism. It's a fact, and it makes sense given what you know now about how that trust was used. She paused. But I also think you've been so careful about not trusting that you've stopped being able to tell the difference between a situation where caution is necessary and a situation where it's just protecting yourself from something that isn't actually a threat. The room was very quiet. The coffee maker finished its cycle and clicked off. You're not a threat, he said. The way he said it, not smoothly, not easily, with a small, rough quality at the edge of it that was the mark of a sentence that cost something, told her more than the words did. No, she said. I'm not. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk and turned his hand over, palm up, and set it there between them, not reaching for her, not asking, just making something available. And she looked at it and looked at him and put her hand in his, and his fingers closed around it, and that was all. No declaration, no resolution, no neat architecture to put it in. Just two people in a hotel room with morning light coming through the gap in the curtains, sitting with something that had grown in the dark and the noise and the wreckage without either of them planning for it. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. He heard it, and his thumb moved slightly against her hand. That was enough. The weeks that followed were not clean or easy. Nothing that comes after something like that is clean or easy. And she'd known that going in, the same way you know in the early hours of a crisis that the crisis ending is not the same as the crisis being over, there is always the long administrative aftermath of what happened. The forms and the statements and the institutional machinery that has to process the fact of a thing before it can be filed. Tessa gave 4 formal statements over 6 weeks. She attended 2 federal hearings as a witness. She answered questions about what she'd found and when and how with the same precision she'd used from the beginning. And she watched Souza and his colleagues build the case with the pieces she'd provided and the pieces Marcus provided and the pieces that came from the Newark servers. And she understood that she was watching the architecture of Lucian's 30 years being taken apart by people whose job it was to take things apart. And it was both less satisfying and more thorough than she had expected, which was probably the correct result. Lucien was processed without drama. He didn't contest the charges in the early stages. He sat in his hearings with the composure of a man who has understood for some time that the particular game he was playing had a finite number of moves left, and who has decided that his dignity in the endgame is the one thing still worth protecting. The 12 names from the Newark server led to 41 charges across 3 federal jurisdictions. The Dravik network's domestic operations collapsed within a month. Dozens of people were freed from trafficking situations that had been running under the network's cover, an outcome that appeared in federal press releases in the language of institutional accomplishment and that Tessa read twice, the second time in the specific way you read something when you need it to be real before you can let it be good. Calloway and 2 other council members cooperated fully. The 3 who had been prepositioned with Lucien most deeply took terms and were removed from any organizational role. The council itself was restructured under the framework Damian had spent the previous 2 years quietly building toward: legitimate operations, oversight structures, the slow, careful work of transforming an institution built on one set of principles into something that could operate under a different set without collapsing. Marcus resigned from his operational role voluntarily and then agreed to stay on in an advisory capacity, which Damian accepted with a directness that acknowledged what Marcus had done and what he'd been unable to do earlier without turning either one into a verdict. She watched that conversation from across a room and thought, this is what it looks like when people try to be honest with each other about complicated things. And it doesn't look like movies. It looks like 2 tired people working through something hard with the best language they have available. Roth recovered. It took 6 weeks and 2 surgeries and the particular slow progress of physical damage undoing itself on its own schedule. But he recovered, and when Damian visited him at the rehabilitation facility in week 4, Tessa went with him, and Roth looked at her from his hospital bed and said, "You figured it out from the handwriting." And she said, "From the handwriting and from a lot of other things." And he nodded like a man filing information he intends to use later, and she thought that was probably a good sign. Sylvie stayed. She didn't say anything about staying. She simply continued in the brownstone's rhythms as if nothing had been decided because nothing needed to be decided, which was its own kind of statement. One morning, 3 weeks after the terminal, she set coffee in front of Tessa in the kitchen and sat down across from her, which was something she hadn't done before, and said, "The 4th floor study. He's been up there more." Tessa looked at her. "I know." "The photographs," Sylvie said. "I know," Tessa said again, and she did. She knew that he was sitting with what Lucien had told him in that glass office above the harbor, sitting with 8 years of believing one thing and the specific, irrecoverable cost of having been manipulated into believing it. She knew he was up there because she could hear him sometimes, and she knew better than to go up. He came down when he was ready. One evening in the 3rd week, he came into the kitchen and sat at the table, and she was making the leftover rice she'd been thinking about for most of this story, standing at the stove. And he sat and was quiet for a while, and she let him be quiet. "She went to Italy," he said finally. She turned. He was looking at the table. "Mara," he said, "I found out where she is. She's been in Florence for 6 years. She teaches art history." He paused. "She doesn't know I know. I'm not going to contact her." He was quiet for another moment. "I just needed to know she was okay." She stood at the stove and looked at him and thought about what it takes to say something like that. To sit with 8 years of misdirected anger and grief and the specific loneliness of a betrayal that wasn't actually a betrayal, and to arrive at the end of it not at rage or reckoning, but at simply needing to know that someone is okay. She thought about what that costs and what it means, and she turned back to the stove and said, "She's okay." "Yes," he said. They ate the rice at the kitchen table with Sylvie's good tea and the sounds of the house around them and the city beyond that. And it was the most ordinary meal she'd had since the night this started. And she thought about ordinary in the specific way you think about it after a long time without it, not as the absence of something, but as its own kind of thing, its own texture, the particular warmth of a table and food and another person and no emergency requiring your immediate management. Lena came for dinner the following Saturday. She'd gone back to her apartment, which was paid up, the lease renegotiated, the broker Eddie having been identified in the federal proceedings as one of Gregor Voss's placement operatives, and having had a very bad 6 weeks as a result. She came in with a bottle of wine and looked around the brownstone with the same considering eyes she'd been looking at everything with since she woke up in that hotel room. And she found a job in the marketing firm 2 blocks from her apartment and had been to see a counselor twice, which she mentioned without being asked, which told Tessa what she needed to know about where her sister was putting her energy. She watched Lena and Damian talk over dinner with the attention she always paid to people she cared about in the same room. They were careful with each other in the way that people are careful when they understand what the other person has cost someone they love. A mutual accounting, made without words, across the dinner table. Damian told her, at some point, about the 12 names from Newark and what the federal operation had found behind them, and Lena listened and didn't say anything for a moment and then said, How many people did you say were freed? And he told her, and she nodded and looked at her wine glass. That's not nothing, she said. No, he said. It's not. It doesn't undo what the organization was, Lena said. Not accusing, reckoning. No, he said again. It doesn't. But I'm not trying to undo it. I'm trying to build something different in the same space. He paused. Those are different projects. Lena looked at him. Are you going to hurt my sister? The table was quiet. Tessa opened her mouth and Lena held up one hand, still looking at Damian, and Damian looked back at her with the specific quality of a man who understands that this is the right question and that the person asking it has earned the right to ask it. I'm going to try very hard not to, he said. That's the most honest answer I can give you. Lena considered this for a long moment. Then she picked up her wine. That's the right answer, she said. The wrong answer would have been a guarantee. Tessa looked at her sister. Lena caught her eye and lifted her glass slightly, a small private gesture. And Tessa felt something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. Since before the phone call, since before the parking garage, maybe since long before that, since the years of managing everything alone and calling it fine, come a small but real degree looser. 6 weeks after the terminal, on an early morning when the air had the particular quality of a city in transition between seasons, Tessa went up to the 4th floor for the first time. She did not go in secret. She walked up the stairs in the early morning light and came to the door of the study and found it open, and Damian was inside, standing at the window the way she'd first seen Lucian standing at a window in a different room in what felt like a different life. He heard her on the threshold and turned, and he didn't look surprised. She came in. The room was smaller than she'd imagined. A working study, books actually used, a desk with actual papers, photographs on one wall that she looked at from across the room. Family photographs, decades of them. Lucian in some of them, younger, before she understood what he was. Damian at various ages, a child, a teenager, a young man who had not yet learned to close his face against the world. A woman who appeared in several and then didn't, and she looked at her without lingering, this woman in Italy who taught art history and did not know the shape of the grief she'd been assigned, and thought, I hope she stays okay. She looked at Damian. He was watching her look at the photographs with an openness he wouldn't have had 6 weeks ago, a willingness to be seen looking at the things he looked at when he thought no one was watching. I owe you a conversation, he said. You don't owe me anything, she said. I accused you, he said. Not in words, but I reached for it. I reached for the easy interpretation because I've been reaching for it for 8 years, and it's the shape my hand knows. He looked at her. That was wrong. It was... He stopped. I don't say I'm sorry very easily. I know, she said. I'm saying it anyway. She looked at him across the study, in the morning light, surrounded by the photographs of a life that had been partially built on a lie someone else installed in it, and she thought about what he was doing, not fixing it, not explaining it, not making a case, just standing in the acknowledgement of it and saying so. She thought about what that cost a man like this, and she thought, this is someone trying. Not perfectly, not smoothly, not with the particular performed humility that people offer when they want to be forgiven rather than honest. Just someone trying. I know, she said again, and this time it meant something different. She moved to the window beside him and looked out. The garden below, with its locked iron gate that she had looked at from her room for 6 weeks without ever going into it, was catching the early light. It was, as she had thought from above, unreasonably beautiful for something in the middle of this city. The garden, she said. He looked down at it. My mother planted most of it before she died. She looked at it for a while. Then, someone should use it. He turned and looked at her. There was something in his face that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory, something careful and real and slightly unguarded, the face underneath the face. Someone should, he said. They stood there for a while, side by side at the window, the city running its particular morning routines below and around them, ordinary and continuous and entirely indifferent to what it had taken for 2 people to be standing in this room on this morning with the light coming in at this angle. She thought about this contract, still technically operative, still with its defined term and its conditions and its 18-month clock. And she thought about how some things that start as one kind of arrangement become, in the living of them, a completely different kind of thing that the original document has no language for. She thought about a parking garage at 2 in the morning and a woman who almost didn't answer the phone. She was glad she answered the phone. "Come downstairs," she said. I'll make coffee." He looked at her, that something not quite a smile again. "You know where the coffee is?" "I know where everything is," she said. "I paid attention." She left the fourth-floor study and went down the stairs into the rest of the house, which was waking up around her in its quiet, efficient way. Sylvie somewhere in the kitchen already, the sounds of morning moving through the walls. Behind her, she heard his footsteps on the stairs, unhurried, following. She went into the kitchen and found the coffee and started it, and the smell of it rose into the morning air of that old brownstone with its garden that no one used and its photographs and its careful, complicated history. And she stood at the counter and let herself feel, fully and without management, what it was to have survived something. Not triumphantly, not easily, but genuinely, with the particular knowledge that comes from going through something real and coming out the other side still knowing who you are. The coffee maker ran. Sylvie appeared and looked at both of them and didn't say a word, which was its own kind of thing. Lena would call in an hour. Marcus would send a document that required 2 responses. The institutional machinery of consequence would continue its work. There was still a great deal to take apart and a great deal to build, and none of it would be quick or clean or without cost. But the coffee was almost ready, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and she was still here, and so was he. And outside in the garden that nobody used, the flowers her mother-in-law had planted in some previous decade were opening in the early light, small and persistent, and entirely unaware that they had survived a winter. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.